This is episode 471 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by an old friend, Paul Teller. He is Executive Director of Advancing American Freedom.
Good to see you, sir.
Yeah, good to be back in the same room with you. We go back 20 years to you were on Capitol Hill, and I was working at the National Taxpayers Union up there in D.C. And yeah, you've been doing a lot of different stuff, and I want to get into a little bit of that, a little bit of Advancing American Freedom, and just talk about what you're doing, boots on the ground here in the state of New Mexico. But
absolutely,
yeah, great to see you again, friend. And well, let's take a little bit of a trip down memory lane. We got together and got to know each other when you were the head as a staffer of the Republican Study Committee, which was the conservative group of House of Representative members. And you've been involved in politics throughout the intervening 2 decades. So let me just ask you a question. You know, there's a different group of kind of conservatives in charge in the House. They made a few headlines recently.
Exactly.
Talk about how that conservative group and those people on Capitol Hill have ebbed and flowed and evolved in recent years. And you, by the way, real quickly, that was headed up by Mike Pence, who you're still working with and for. But when he was a congressman from Indiana, he was the head of the Republican Study Committee as a member of Congress while you were the staffer. So you and Mike Pence go back a ways. But talk about just this evolution that we've seen in Washington.
Yeah, I first met Mike Pence. It was actually late 2000. He was a brand new member. I was working for the House Administration Committee. We were helping set up kind of the new member orientation. Met him that way. He actually struck me because he and his wife were inseparable. They would literally walk around the Capitol complex, if not holding hands, at least at each other's side all the time. And that struck me because, as you can imagine, in Washington, you don't always see that. Faithfulness to one spouse is not necessarily the prime value that you see in politics. So that struck me. Yeah. Then he immediately became a very active member of the House Republican Study Committee, Conservative Caucus. As you said, chairman. It was, I think, 2005, 2006, and I was a staffer, worked for him then and afterwards, and then all through the White House. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I would take up your whole podcast here to go through the entire history, but a couple quick highlights. So, the Republican Study Committee actually founded back in the 1970s by a guy by the name of Ed Follner, who founded the Heritage Foundation. Many of your listeners may know the Heritage Foundation. And it founded back then as a Republican way to keep its own leadership in check and keep on track with conservative principles. Flash forward to my time there, the early and mid 2000s, and that mission stayed. And the members who were part of it always had as their, raison d'etre, if you will, getting up in the morning to advance conservative principles, do what we said we would do, hold to our promises. And unfortunately, that's not always an easy thing to do in Washington, even within your own party. The House Freedom Caucus was created, I think it was 2014, as a splinter group from the Republican Study Committee when some members felt the Republican Study Committee had gotten too big, gotten away from its core mission, and things like that. So yeah, now you have these kind of two.
Now that's after you
caucuses.
left as a staffer, so you can't take credit or blame for that. Now, does the Republican Study Committee exist anymore, or is it the Freedom Caucus now?
Yeah, they both still exist. The Republican Study Committee, again, remains the larger of the two caucuses. I would say their expertise is just deep in the weeds policy development. If you want to help with a bill drafted, if you want a detailed policy brief to write or read about bill coming to the floor, understanding what amendments are being allowed on the floor, Republican Study Committee is your place. Freedom Caucus seems to have developed its brand. It's more of a kind of a floor action team where they're not necessarily writing deep policy briefs, but they'll put that fight that's needed on the House floor, which again, many of the members you saw during Kevin McCarthy's speaker's vote came out of the Freedom Caucus to say, hey, let's advance conservative principles. Let's make the House a better place to govern for conservative policies for individual members of Congress.
Yeah, well, many a morning spent there with yourself and good friend Norm Singleton,
Oh,
working
yes.
with Ron Paul, of course, when he was a
Absolutely.
member of the House of Representatives way back in those days in the Republican Study Committee. So, a very good time. And, it's hard to compare and contrast the political situation. Obviously, things are more fractured and fractious in terms of the public policy environment and individual people and the way they interact with each other these days. And it'd be interesting to just see how those things have changed and ebbed and flowed. But
well, by the way, I should
yeah,
just jump in and say that you were always a fantastic participant in that in those Monday meetings, because they were always a place to just kind of battle ideas, and not in a harsh way, a very respectful way, right? I mean, it's when no one got into trouble from going to those meetings. We just had kind of principled discussions of not only what is the best policy, but then how do you get it? What's the strategy, right? Because you may even a room of 150 people may agree, hey, we got to get to this point, but how do we get there may be the difference. Do we fight right now? Do we wait to a different time of the year? Do we offer an amendment to this bill or wait to that bill? Things like that. So you were always great with that strategy.
Well, thanks. And those, of course, were the waning days of the George W. Bush administration and the early days of the Obama administration. So some tricky and challenging waters of their own to navigate there. But certainly today, with especially the narrow numbers that McCarthy has in the House, really tricky time to be trying to herd those cats up on Capitol Hill. I don't envy that, and I bet you're happy to be doing what you're doing with Mr. Pence and the Advancing American Freedom organization here.
Yes, and it's a fantastic opportunity. I'm sure we'll get into that, but I do have to say during the fight for the speaker's vote and what the members of Congress were offering and negotiations, I did have a moment of saying, man, I do miss being a House Conservative Caucus staffer, to be in the middle of that and trying to figure out what is the right thing to do and how do you get it done, and to use your phrase, how do you herd the cats and things like that. So there were moments of missing it.
Now, before we do get into your latest project here with Mr. Pence, you obviously didn't just go from the Republican Study Committee to this organization. You also spent some time in the Trump White House, part of that with Mike Pence in the vice president's office, or working with him in that office. But talk about being a part of the Trump administration. What did you do, and what were kind of the, big challenges in your personal work, aside from what everybody knows of the Trump administration that 4 years?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, so went from the Republican Study Committee to Ted Cruz's office. Senator Ted Cruz, was privileged to be his deputy chief. The chief of staff at the time was Chip Roy, now a congressman. I have a feeling you may have heard of his name.
Yeah.
I was blessed to be his deputy chief when he was the chief. When Chip decided to go permanently back to Texas to start his run for Congress, I was privileged to be Ted Cruz's chief when he ran for president. Amazing opportunity, amazing experience, great honor. And then went into the Trump-Pence White House, was there all 4 years, was there on day 6, not day 1, which some folks always held over me that I wasn't there for the inauguration, but we didn't get our paperwork filed in time, and I was there on day 6, all the way to the end, all the way to the last day. And 3 of the 4 years, the first 3 years were, I was privileged to be in legislative affairs, White House legislative affairs. So working with the most conservative senators, most conservative House members, and then the conservative groups like yours, my friend, working kind of the 3 kind of core groups like that, House and Senate conservatives and conservative groups, working to advance the president's legislative agenda, doing our best to get wins where we could. And then the 4th year, moved over to the vice president's office, where I did conservative outreach, a little bit to Capitol Hill, but much more to the conservative groups. And as you check your calendar, that 4th year, the administration was basically the COVID year. So did a lot with respect to that 4th year.
And, talk about evolution of things on Capitol Hill. Obviously, President Trump's rise to power, his 4 years as president, is really a watershed in the way people perceive American politics. I mean, politics and policy are always controversial, but never in our lifetimes has a president been under the microscope for everything and put himself out there and drawn attention to himself the way President Trump did. Were you ever, say, briefing somebody about policy X, and then suddenly President Trump's on Twitter saying, why is what we're going to do here? Talk just about how things went, the pluses, the minuses, everything during that time as summarily as you can within the scope of this podcast.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you're right. That'll be 5 other podcasts we could do just talk about that. But yeah, the quick version is, it just was an amazingly dynamic experience because in one sense, the president was your greatest amplifier, right? In other words, if you're going to the Hill and you say, hey, I'd like to push this bill, this amendment, things like that, and all of a sudden a tweet comes across that is echoing and amplifying what you're saying to that senator, that member of Congress, that staffer at that moment. Wow, fantastic. But as you just alluded to, there were occasions where it would be the opposite, and we'd have to kind of double back and say, tell you what, Mr. Congressman, let me get back to you on that. let me check with the home base at the White House and see where we are going with that policy and get back to you. So there were those moments. But I tell you, to flip back to the positive side, what was so refreshing was to have a president who just so wanted to cut through the bureaucracy that at times, and again, I know many folks were critical, but sometimes those tweets he would put out, especially policy ones, legislative ones, they would just cut through what otherwise would be weeks or months of bureaucratic back and forth, kind of the normal, swamp creature procedure in DC. And he just kind of said, no, we're doing this, period, full stop. And we'd look at ourselves and say, okay, that's the policy. There we go. We just did things a lot more efficiently, faster, and clearer. So there were a lot of benefits to those things.
Now, I assume you work kind of on a broad scale on his legislative agenda. People can say whether it was a successful agenda or not. I would assume that the tax cuts were probably the highest profile and greatest success, but kind of give an appraisal of those 4 years of Trump's record in terms of passing a legislative agenda and anything that you worked on that you thought maybe was underrated or something that people should be aware of that maybe they're not.
Yeah, no, great points. I think it was tremendous success when you look at the kind of the arc of the 4 years. Yeah, there were moments we were all frustrated. I think a perfect example, and I'm sure your listeners would agree, the promise to repeal Obamacare, right? That's probably, I think, what frustrated so many of us on the inside who were so ready. We'd made these promises. Congress had made these promises. Candidates had made promises. We were ready to go. We had Republican control of the House and Senate, a president who was ready to sign a repeal Obamacare bill that would hit his desk. And then we just ran into this big brick wall of the United States Congress there were unfortunately not enough Republicans who really wanted to keep that promise. And that was real unfortunate.
Specifically the Senate. Right. I mean, because the House, I don't remember if they passed anything or not, but certainly John McCain and a handful of other senators were a sticking point.
Yeah, that was a huge sticking point. Although, frankly, even the House, though, there wasn't just a straight repeal.
Fair enough.
Right? It was just kind of, a lot of, I don't know how you describe it, but just a lot of ifs, a lot of buts, a lot of this would stay in place, this would go back in. A lot of things that I don't think matched what America was hoping for in an Obamacare repeal, legislation. So the good news on that front, though, was I think we spent the rest of the administration doing as much as we could, absent a full repeal of Obamacare, to weaken the law, allow folks to get around the law more, allow for more healthcare choice, deregulation, things like that. So even in an area where we could say, okay, that was a disappointment, there were successes to be found. But you're right, the tax legislation, huge success. Trade, right? The USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada trade agreement, huge success in bringing trade barriers down and regulation down. And again, an example of how the president used his tough negotiating style to get folks to the table who maybe either otherwise wouldn't have come to the table or would have come to the table with not too many demands or not many things to offer, and he showed how to do it. So that was, I think, another great success. Obviously, I think just the nominations, right? Let's face it, whether it be judicial or even just throughout his administration, putting true movement conservatives throughout the administration, putting true constitutional conservatives on courts across the land, of course, especially the Supreme Court. Just that may go down as one of the greatest legacies of the president that will last, well beyond any of our times in politics.
How significantly were you involved in those in shepherding those folks through? Because that is something that people often gloss over, the fact that it's a legislative process to get those Supreme Court candidates into justices.
Yeah, and that's something that we in legislative affairs were, tip of the spear for that. That was something because, these things don't just happen, right? You have to count votes. You have to figure out who's an automatic yes, who's an automatic no, who's in between. Can you move a senator or a member of Congress based on, other things? If we do a vote on this, can you vote on that? Things like that. The horse trading that goes on in Washington, some of which I know gets a negative impression, but a lot of it is just legitimate policy discussions and exchanges and, human to human convincing of trying to get folks on board. So yeah, it was a tremendous honor and sometimes not easy, but we did get a lot done that way. No question.
Nice. Now let's go ahead and fast forward to Advancing American Freedom, which you're the executive director of. It's an organization, I guess it's safe to say, founded by Mike Pence.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Your advisory board is a all-star group of conservative activists, legislators, and luminaries. Gary Bauer, Ken Blackwell. He's a Cincinnati guy originally, like I am. So
pulling out all the Ohio guys. I see.
I know Blackwell from way back in the day. Brent Bozell, Kirk Cameron, the actor, and Jim DeMint, of course. Doug Ducey out here in this direction from Arizona. And I could go on and on. Scott Walker, of course, as well. But kind of run through what your organization is trying to do and what brings you to New Mexico, I guess, specifically.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for pointing out the advisory board. It's one of the things we're most proud of, how many folks across the conservative spectrum have said, hey, put my name and likeness on your website and count me in as a consistent advisor. And by the way, that is something we do with our advisory board. It's not there just for show. Ask any of them. We're in constant touch, emailing, texting, phone calls. We do Zooms, we do in-person meetings, trying to get their actual advice. And to step back, so Advancing American Freedom, as you said, it's founded by Mike Pence as, if you will, his policy home base after the White House. But more importantly, he really has been using it through us as staff to advance the principles of freedom in three arenas, if you will. I like to divide it up in past, present, and future. So past, we are touting the successes of the 4 years of the Trump-Pence years, just as we were talking about. We want to defend that legacy. We had tremendous policy successes, and we're always talking about that. Present is pushing back as hard as we can against, Schumer, Pelosi, now Jeffries, obviously Biden, Harris, anyone on the left who's trying to undo those conservative successes that made America so much more prosperous and so much more free. And then future, and this is kind of our bread and butter day to day, is building new policies, new legislation, coalitions, messaging, anything we can to advance new policies, new ideas of freedom, to earn conservative wins in the future, to bring freedom back to America, which is unfortunately eroding as we speak. You see that every day in the news, unfortunately. And then that leads me to why we're here in New Mexico. We're just doing periodic trips around the country to really just listen, learn, connect, hear what's going on in the real world, get outside the bubble of the Washington Beltway, get outside the swamp, and see how the policies we're talking about advancing every day, how they would impact in the real world. What are folks doing on the ground to advance freedom? What's working, what's not working? So New Mexico has been a state that's been on our minds, frankly, for months. And we got to get there. So many of the key issues that we've been working on are, if you will, ground zero here, from education to energy, immigration, land use, and just et cetera, et cetera. So very excited to be here and, learn from you guys.
Well, excellent. Again, folks can go to advancingamericanfreedom.com to check out that website. And if you click on the, I don't know, 3 lines right next to the donate button. You don't have to, I'm not asking anybody to donate. You donate to the Rio Grande. No, just kidding.
Exactly.
If you donate to both. But the 3 lines will get you kind of a menu set up there. And right there, your website has Energy Dominance
Yes.
Campaign. And that certainly speaks to New Mexico and New Mexicans. And there's a chart I can show you when we're off the air showing New Mexico's oil production. And I don't know if you know this, but we are now the second biggest oil producing state in the entire country.
It's amazing.
Mostly that is coming out of the Permian Basin, which we share with Texas, which is the number 1 producing state in the country. And it's just an unprecedented oil boom that this state is undergoing. You might not see it because our policymakers and politicians tend to fritter it away. But we are definitely contributing to what you nationally are working on, which is, kind of a energy independence agenda and energy dominance concept. So talk about energy as you and your organization are working through it.
Yeah, huge issue for us. Maybe one of our top 3 issues that we've worked on in the last 2 years that we've been in existence. And yeah, that American Energy Dominance Campaign, thanks for finding that. And yeah, I would encourage your listeners to go to that, mainly because we've lamented as an organization that America has lost that energy dominance, right? In other words, under the Trump-Pence 4 years, America was energy independent. It was an exporter to so many countries. And while that's good, not just economically, we're seeing how good that is geopolitically, right? I'm sure many Europeans are wishing they had gotten more of their energy from us than from Russia, and what a terrible position that's putting them in right now in the war in Ukraine. So things like that. So we want to tout the importance of being American, not just independent, but dominant. The world's leading producer of energy has so many benefits, to the American family, but of course, it's just the American, national security, national dominance. So check out that campaign right on the website. It's mostly a video campaign where we ran ads on social media, on TV, in certain congressional districts where folks had Democrats representing them that were taking away American energy independence, American energy dominance. So we just put messages together saying the Biden-Harris regime, it is bad for America because it's bad for American energy. And we just want to keep emphasizing that message. And again, coming here to the ground to learn more of your experience here and how we can best amplify and help.
Yeah. Well, just on that note, of course, the decision to abolish the Keystone XL pipeline was maybe the largest generator of headlines and remains a contentious issue. But shortly thereafter, the Biden administration claimed it was putting a moratorium on new permits on oil and gas, and it kind of has, kind of hasn't. It hasn't completely stopped it, but that is an arrow or a dagger directly at New Mexico and its economy and its upsurge in energy production, because no other state is impacted by federal land management and the estates like New Mexico, because once you cross that magical line between Texas and New Mexico and kind of you make that line go all the way up to Canada, everything west of that line is heavily federal ownership, and everything east of it generally is private sector or owned maybe by a state trustee situation. But once you get out west here, the federal government plays a very outsized role. And, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know federal land management is something that you'll hear a lot about as you talk to people, certainly in the industry. And those debates get pretty contentious pretty quick.
Oh, yeah, no question. And again, that's something we're here to particularly learn about. What we don't want to do is be those guys from Washington coming around saying, here, we're going to tell you what you should think. I mean, it's ridiculous. Too many people do that. We're not doing that. So we're here mostly to learn. But what we have read about New Mexico, and it's really an American energy renaissance, right? I mean, it's just, it's like a hockey stick. If you look at a chart of oil and gas production of New Mexico in the last, 10 years or so, particularly in the last maybe 5 or 6, just off the charts. You have to almost make a new chart, new grid to get the line on there. It's fantastic. We just want to understand how that's happened, what the barriers are, how we can work to eliminate those barriers, and even just rhetorically, how can we, push back against anyone in Washington or out of Washington who wants to kind of denigrate American energy, wants to denigrate the folks who pull natural gas, oil, other sources of energy out of the ground, and as if they're bad people. So, very much looking forward to that.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, definitely, we have some opportunities to talk to you about things, and pipelines, I will say, are a big part of that conversation.
Absolutely.
But you also have something that in those 3 lines at the advancingamericanfreedom.com, we the people freedom agenda.
Yes.
What is the freedom agenda? I see culture, American opportunity, American leadership. Kind of briefly walk us through each of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's funny. Our founder, Vice President Mike Pence, said to us, guys, the name of our group is Advancing American Freedom. Shouldn't we have a really detailed plan for how to advance American freedom? We said, boss, it's a good idea. We probably should have thought of it ourselves. But so we went on a months-long journey, if you will, through the conservative movement, through private sector, just listening, talking. We wound up talking directly to at least 50 top leaders in the conservative movement, including many on our advisory board, but also just other industry leaders across a wide variety of issues, and put together this roadmap for how do you restore, how do you advance freedom in America. And as you pointed out, it is broken up into those 3 sections: American culture, American opportunity, American leadership. And just, if you go through it, it's on the website. We've got videos, we've got, different things you can click on to, it's an interactive place where you can just find ideas that you can use. If you're a candidate, if you're a legislator, frankly, if you just want to have a conversation with someone who's not totally on board with the things you're looking at, in terms of freedom, go there. You'll get great ideas. And now our challenge is to get many of those ideas for freedom into law federally and at the state level, which is something we're going to talk to you about as well.
Yeah. So your mission as an organization is educating and organizing, presumably conservatives or open-minded independents and moderates across the country. And, kind of
Absolutely.
let's go into the current situation as it exists. Obviously, partisanship is at a all-time high. I think a lot of conservatives and Republicans were disappointed by the results of November's election. And, where do you see things going, and how do you, in your organization, see us trying to get there?
Yeah, it's it's definitely going to be a challenge, but I believe we're up to it, and Vice President Pence is certainly up to it. He's lived through many political challenges and other challenges throughout life, so we're ready for it. But I think what we're trying to do is, again, take these ideas of freedom that we've mapped out. And by the way, we've mapped them out in what we hope is the clearest language possible. We tried to avoid, Washington jargon, bill numbers, law numbers, things that just make it hard to use and understand and repeat in a conversation. So check it out, the Freedom Agenda at advancingamericanfreedom.com. And, how do we get those ideas, which are simple and strong but powerful, how do we get them into action? Some of them are just culturally based. It's just a matter of people in their communities, in their, private organizations, in their families, talking more about freedom, implementing things that, promote freedom and things like that. Like you've seen with parents, for example, going before school boards and advancing freedom that way. But some of the ideas will have to be in legislative form. So that's kind of a spin-off project we just started with the Freedom Agenda. We call it the Future of Freedom, where we're going to go issue by issue and say, okay, to get the ideas of freedom in, let's say, energy into legislative format, here are some things we can do. Oh, by the way, here are some bills at the federal level that have already been introduced. Let's just pass those bills, amplifying the good work that some legislators have already done, maybe providing a model for state legislators to say, okay, maybe we'll copy that at the state level. Let's as appropriate, let's enact those in the state level. So we'll be doing a lot of those future freedom spin-offs in different issues. And we think that could be a way to help get these the ideas of freedom through even a tightly, very narrow Congress.
Yeah, I mean, bipartisanship is, I don't know about a foreign word these days, but it's certainly uncommon and something that is very, very challenging. It seems like the parties in Washington are further apart than even when we were up there 20 or so years ago doing work together. I mean, is that, would you say, an accurate statement to say that the parties are more divergent in their policy goals, let alone kind of their approaches to policy issues, but just looking at things completely differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think on many things, yes. Where I think we as conservatives have a little work to still do is on federal spending, no. Meaning, like, there's not a huge difference between Democrats and Republicans on federal
there's
spending.
unity in the wrong direction.
Right. There is tremendous bipartisan activity to increase spending in Washington. There has been, for my 30 years in that town. So that should change. And I think conservatives want it to change. I actually even think most Republicans want it to change, and we'd be shocked to see some of their own representatives who were consistently voting for higher spending. It looks like, however, that this, the Republican House led by Kevin McCarthy is saying we are going to put a stop to the excessive spending. We are going to fight for it. And one such way might be using the debt ceiling as a leverage point, meaning like the U.S. government is about to reach the ceiling or the supposed ceiling of how much debt it could take out. And so for the folks who want to raise that debt ceiling, many conservatives, many Republicans are going to say we need some spending restraint and cuts in exchange for that.
Yeah, the debt ceiling kind of reminds me of the scene in Return of the Jedi where Princess Leia in the dress of a bounty hunter walks into the Jabba's palace and has the detonator in her hand and kind of like said, "I'm the craziest person in here, and you're going to do what I say." That is a path that has been worn down a bit in the past years by Republicans, and I know you were around for the Obama administration and the sequestration battles and John Boehner and that whole deal. Another Cincinnati guy. Went to my high school, by the way.
Okay.
So what that is a fraught proposition, and I know predicting the outcomes here is very, very difficult. But at least we have a check on the worst excesses of Biden and the Senate Democrats inherent in the House. So I guess my question to you isn't whether that's a wise approach, but can't we just kind of constrain things being with the House and try to just put a little brake on the runaway size of government?
Yeah.
Talk about that, the decisions that need to be made there.
Yeah, no question. I do think that's going to be a huge goal. Frankly, that's some of the things that those 20 conservatives negotiated with Speaker McCarthy to get their votes or to get their answer of present during the Speaker vote was some votes on reducing spending, making it easier to offer amendments to reduce spending, make it easier to to use the debt ceiling as a leverage point to reduce spending, put a control on it. Some of your listeners may remember a fight from 2011 that we called cut, cap, and balance. That was actually a debt ceiling fight. It was basically conservatives saying, and we led it out of the Republican Study Committee office at the time, conservatives saying, okay, we will raise the debt ceiling a certain amount in exchange for cut, cap, and balance. Immediate spending cuts. I think it was $100 billion at the time, which back then that was real money. Today would hardly be a rounding error. Caps, meaning spending caps going forward. So we're not just cutting now. We're going to have spending controls into the future. I think it was 10 years of spending controls. And balance was we're going to have the House and Senate each pass a balanced budget amendment, send it out to the states for hopeful ratification. So cut, cap, and balance. So there's a lot of folks saying, you know what? We may need to dust off the cut, cap, and balance manual and see if there's any or maybe even all pieces of it that are still relevant to today's debate and see how we could use that to cut some spending.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting time to watch and see how that all plays out because it's we haven't had any fiscal restraints, certainly from the Biden administration. Certainly, COVID had its impacts on the Trump administration, although Trump didn't exactly tout himself as a fiscal conservative. So, we haven't really seen much fiscal restraint in Washington since, I guess the tail end of that whole sequestration battle with Obama in that administration.
Yeah, although the one defense I will give,
I don't want to throw your old boss under the bus.
No, that's all right. We did send budgets. The president develops a budget through the Office of Management and Budget, sends the president's budget down to Capitol Hill, or up to Capitol Hill, I guess I should say. And the ones especially developed by my friend, former colleague Russ Fote, who again is on our advisory board. Yep. When he was director of Office of Management and Budget, the budgets he sent, would lead and put together the president's budget, obviously, but he was the brains behind it. Tremendous amount of cuts in both discretionary and mandatory. In other words, things that are kind of the Congress revisits every year, and also things that are on autopilot, supposed autopilot. All of those things were in the budget to either be cut, eliminated, phased out, phased down, reduced, change the formula so that your automatic payments aren't as much, things like that. Of course, Congress kind of looked and laughed at that and said, well, we're not interested in those kind of robust spending cuts, spending controls, and we're going to instead do many spending increases, very often packaging it together in one giant omnibus appropriations bill, a spending bill, lands on President Trump's desk at the last minute. And he says, he's basically given the option of either sign this horrible bill or shut down the government. And look, there were times we shut down the government, but there were other times that just politically it didn't make sense. And, he would sign things that in a perfect world he didn't want to, and it didn't reflect his budget. But at the time, it seemed like, the lesser of two evils.
Well, fair enough. And we only have a few minutes left here in this conversation. But one of the things that is discussed as a way to kind of restore not just sanity in the budget and policymaking process, but is restoring regular order and getting away from these, I don't know, is it omnibuy? Right. Gigantic spending proposals that that get shoved down everybody's throats in Washington, and you put a mishmash of different policies and riders into them, and you know that they're too big to fail. Well,
exactly.
Restoring Congress's role in the policymaking process, I've got to assume that as a former Hill staffer and the roles that you took within the conservative movement, plus Mike Pence being of that background, that's got to be a priority just in general for everybody in Washington, right?
Yeah, no question. I think one of the biggest things is, how during, again, that speaker vote, there were negotiations to not do these spending omnibuses again, omniba, whatever the word is. And instead, it looks like, at least through the House, obviously, you can't promise what the Senate's going to do, Democrat controlled, but at least through the Republican House, they're going to do, I believe, 12 separate appropriations bills. It's not to say those are tiny either. They're still going to be big, expensive bills, but at least when you have 12 bills, greater transparency, greater accountability, more chance for individual members of the House to amend these bills and say, I want to take this spending out, I want to cut here, I want to eliminate there. Much more opportunity, because when you have one big bill, take it or leave it, right before Christmas time or something, many members, frankly, just out of sheer human exhaustion, just say, you know what, get me out of here. I give up. I cry uncle. There's a few things in there I like, so I guess I'll vote for it. And it winds up being not great legislating, not great policymaking, not good for America. So it looks like we are going to get a better process, at least through the House. And I'm hoping we could convince the Senate to either, if not do a similar process, at least be forced to take some of the good wins and the good spending cuts, the spending reductions, the reforms, deregulation, et cetera, that comes through the House.
All right. Excellent. Well, before I let you go, any last thoughts that you want to share? Anything I missed in this conversation?
No, I mean, just grateful to be with you and your listeners. Great to be in New Mexico. This will hopefully not be the only trip. This is kind of a preliminary trip. Maybe we can get Vice President Pence back here. He was here a few months ago, I believe maybe in the southern part of the state, but we want to get him back up this way and just make sure we're constantly engaging. So if you have ideas, that we should be promoting ideas of freedom, things that are working or not working in New Mexico that we should be, touting publicly with the wonderful megaphone of the vice president, please let us know. Go to our website, advancingamericanfreedom.com, and just please let us know. We'll work together.
Well, if there is a way to get the Rio Grande Foundation involved in sponsorship of an event or more events than one with Mike Pence, I'd love to be a part of that.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show, and thank you, Paul Teller, for being a part of it.
No, thanks. Appreciate it. Good to see you.